2 years ago, my signature on a napkin sketch was worth $10 million. Today, that same signature is on an eviction notice. I lost a $75 million empire built on genius code, all because of a fatal flaw that had nothing to do with technology. And the crazy part, I'm better for it. This is how. That's not an exaggeration for a flashy intro. That's my life, condensed into two polar opposite realities. At 28, Forbes called me a digital Midas. Venture capitalists who wouldn't have given me the time of day a few years prior were now quoting my own words back to me in boardrooms. I had a penthouse in San Francisco that overlooked the Golden Gate Bridge, a garage that held more horsepower than a cavalry, and a net worth of $75 million. By my 30th birthday, all of it was gone. Not some of it. Every last cent. I was bankrupt, sleeping on a friend's couch, and my name had become a cautionary tale whispered at Silicon Valley cocktail parties. This story isn't a plea for sympathy, and it's not really a guide on how to get rich or even how to avoid losing it all. It's a confession. It's the story of how I flew so high I thought I could touch the sun, only to have the wax wings of my own ego melt completely. It's about how I lost myself in the blinding glare of success, and how only in the total darkness of failure I finally began to see who I truly was. So yes, we'll get to the private jets and the billion-dollar deals, but stick around for the real story, the one about what happens after the fall. Before we dive into that whirlwind, if you're new to this channel, I'd appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you know. And I'm always curious to see how far these stories travel, so let me know in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It's a small way for us to connect across the world. All right, let's go back to the beginning, back to where it all started. Not in a sleek office, but in a cramped, chaotic dorm room that smelled perpetually of stale coffee and burnt-out ambition. It didn't begin with a business plan. It began with an obsession. I was a computer science major at Stanford, but the lectures felt like they were moving in slow motion. The curriculum was teaching us the history of a war that was still being fought, and I was itching to be on the front lines. The digital world was a living, breathing organism of data, and I wanted to learn its language, to understand its pulse. My obsession was a single powerful concept: predictability. Everyone else was using technology to analyze what had already happened, to react. I wanted to build something that could tell you what was about to happen. My world consisted of 4 walls, 3 monitors, 2 endlessly refilled coffee pots, and one other person who believed in my madness. Ben. Ben was my roommate, my co-founder, and my anchor to reality. He was the pragmatist, the people person, the business mind. While I was chasing the ghost in the machine, trying to write code that felt more like poetry, Ben was the one making sure we could afford the electricity to keep the machine running. He saw a product where I only saw a beautiful, complex puzzle. Together, we spent 20 hours a day fueled by cheap pizza and a shared unspoken belief that we were on the verge of something monumental. The idea was to build an AI engine which we codenamed Aura. The concept was simple to state, but monstrously complex to execute. We wanted Aura to analyze the financial markets not just on a quantitative level, trading volumes, price history, corporate earnings, but on a qualitative, almost emotional level. It would scrape global news, social media sentiment, political discourse, and even the linguistic patterns of financial reports to detect the subtle, underlying currents of fear and greed that truly drive the market. We were trying to teach a machine to predict human irrationality. It sounded like science fiction. To our professors, it sounded like a delusion. So we did the only logical thing. We dropped out. I remember the phone call to my parents. They had sacrificed so much for me to be at a place like Stanford. Telling them I was trading it for a half-baked idea in a dorm room was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. They heard dropout. I heard all in. For the next year, our lives were a monotonous cycle of code, debug, fail, repeat. We burned through my meager savings. We borrowed money from Ben's older sister. We lived off instant noodles and the sheer, unadulterated conviction that we were building the future. And then the break. A small boutique venture capital firm in Palo Alto, known for making risky bets on unproven founders, agreed to a meeting. We walked into a polished boardroom, looking like we'd just crawled out of a server closet. which we pretty much had. I was a nervous wreck, but when I started talking about the architecture of Aura, the passion took over. I explained how it wasn't just an algorithm, but a learning ecosystem. For an hour I talked, and for an hour they listened, their expressions unreadable. At the end, the senior partner, a man named Marcus Thorne, leaned back in his chair and said 5 words that changed my life forever. "Okay, we'll give you a shot." They gave us a seed round of $500,000. I remember looking at Ben as we held that first term sheet. The feeling wasn't pure elation. It was a cocktail of euphoria and absolute bone-chilling terror. The dream was no longer just a dream. It was a funded company. It was a promise. And now we had to deliver on it. And deliver we did. The first version of Aura wasn't just good, it was revolutionary. We deployed it with a handful of small hedge funds as our beta testers. Within 6 months, they were reporting returns that were, by industry standards, impossible. The word began to spread through the tight-knit circles of Silicon Valley and Wall Street. We weren't chasing investors anymore. They were chasing us. The VCs who had ignored our cold emails 6 months ago were now having their assistants call us multiple times a day. Our valuation skyrocketed. It was dizzying. 1 million, 10 million, 50 million. And then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, after closing our Series A funding round, I logged into my personal bank account. I just stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. The number was there. 7 digits. A 1, followed by 6 zeros. My first $1 million. It wasn't just money. It was validation. It was the definitive proof that the weird kid in the dorm room, the college dropout who worried his parents sick, had been right all along. In that moment, I felt invincible. I was hungry, I was focused, and I was utterly relentless. I believed with every fiber of my being that there was no problem I couldn't solve, no system I couldn't bend to my will, and no limit to how high I could climb. I was ready to conquer the world. Little did I know the only enemy that truly mattered, the one that would eventually bring my entire empire crashing down, was already growing, unchecked, right inside of me. They say that money doesn't change you. It just reveals who you truly are. I think that's a comforting lie we tell ourselves. The truth is far more dangerous. Money is not a mirror, it's an amplifier. It takes the quietest whispers of your personality, your insecurities, your ambitions, your fears, and blasts them at the world through a stadium-sized speaker. My quiet need for validation, born in that dorm room, was about to become a deafening roar of arrogance that would drown out everything else. The first million was a milestone. The 10th million was a transformation. Life ceased to be a series of challenges to overcome, and instead became a menu of experiences to be consumed. The San Francisco penthouse wasn't just a place to live. It was a fortress of solitude, perched above the clouds, with floor-to-ceiling windows that swallowed the skyline. I would stand there at night, a glass of obscenely expensive whiskey in my hand, and watch the city lights twinkle below me. They weren't just lights, they were data points, representing millions of lives I could now influence, a system I had effectively mastered. It was a god's eye view, and I started to believe I belonged up there. I bought a McLaren 720S, not because I'm a car enthusiast. I couldn't tell you the first thing about its engine, but because of the way it felt to walk away from it after the valet parked it out front. It was a $300,000 statement that screamed, "I have arrived," so I didn't have to. I bought watches that cost more than my parents' house, not to tell the time, but to feel the reassuring weight of success on my wrist. These weren't purchases, they were armor. Each luxury item was another plate of steel, protecting the insecure college dropout I still felt like on the inside. The people changed, too. My circle of friends, once composed of fellow coders and dreamers who would argue with me about the ethics of AI over cheap beer, was gradually replaced. In their place came a new crowd, fair-weather friends, opportunistic entrepreneurs, and beautiful people with hollow eyes who laughed a little too loudly at my jokes. They didn't challenge me, they validated me, they orbited me, and I mistook their gravitational pull for genuine affection. I was the sun in my own little solar system, and I started to believe my light was self-generated. My ego had staged a silent coup and taken over the corner office of my mind. The humble, collaborative spirit that had fueled Aura's creation began to curdle. The we that Ben and I had built everything on slowly, insidiously, became I. In interviews, I'd find myself saying, I had the vision. I wrote the core algorithm. I knew the market was ready. Ben, my partner, the guy who had kept us from starving and translated my chaotic genius into a viable business, was being relegated to a supporting character in the grand mythology I was writing about myself. He saw it happening long before I did. Ben remained grounded, his feet firmly planted in the reality of spreadsheets and risk analysis, while my head was soaring in the stratosphere of my own hype. He would come into my office, a minimalist glass cube I'd designed to look like something out of a sci-fi movie, and try to talk sense into me. "Alex," he'd say, holding up a tablet with charts and projections, "our burn rate is getting out of control. The parties, the marketing blitzes, the new office lease, we need to build a war chest. We're profitable, but we're vulnerable. We should diversify our personal holdings, maybe sell a small secondary stake to secure our futures." I'd lean back in my $1,000 chair and barely even glance at his data. To me, his prudence felt like an anchor. I mistook his wisdom for weakness, his caution for a lack of vision. "Ben, you're still thinking like we're in the dorm room," I'd say with a dismissive wave of my hand. "You don't win a war by hoarding supplies in the bunker. You win it by taking territory. We're a rocket ship, not a savings account. Stop worrying so much." He'd just shake his head, a look of profound frustration and something else, maybe disappointment in his eyes. The more I dismissed his concerns, the more he tried to press them, and the more I saw him as an obstacle to my grand vision. The first major crack in our foundation appeared not with a bang, but with a phone call from the legal department of Omnicorp. Omnicorp was one of the original giants of the tech world, a massive, sprawling conglomerate that had once been innovative but had grown slow and bureaucratic. They wanted to acquire us, and their offer was staggering. It was a number that would have made us, our families, and our early employees wealthy beyond their wildest dreams for generations to come. It was an exit, the finish line. Ben was ecstatic. He saw it as the ultimate validation of our hard work. "This is it, Alex. We did it," he exclaimed, bursting into my office with the printed term sheet. "We can operate as an independent division with their resources behind us. No more fundraising. No more worrying about competitors. We're safe. We've won." I looked at the number on the page, and I felt nothing but contempt. Safe. Winning. To me, this wasn't a victory. It was a surrender. It was an admission that our creation couldn't stand on its own. It was Omnicorp, a dinosaur of the old guard, trying to buy our relevance, to slap their boring logo on my masterpiece. They didn't want to empower Aura. They wanted to absorb it. The meeting was held in their soulless corporate headquarters in San Jose. We sat across a massive mahogany table from their CEO, a man named Richard Davenport, who wore a perfectly tailored suit and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He spoke in corporate platitudes about synergy and leveraging our assets. He was patronizing, treating us like a couple of bright kids who'd gotten lucky. Ben handled most of the talking, being diplomatic and professional. I just sat there, simmering, my jaw clenched. Finally, Davenport turned to me. "So, Alex," he said, his smile widening slightly, "you're the architect of all this. What do you think about bringing your vision under our wing?" Something inside me snapped. The carefully constructed facade of a professional CEO crumbled, and the raw, unfiltered ego took over. I leaned forward, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "Mr. Davenport, with all due respect, what you call a wing, I call a cage. Your company hasn't had an original idea since the dot-com bubble. You don't build, you buy. Aura isn't just a feature you can plug into your dying ecosystem. It's the future. And frankly, this offer isn't just low. It's an insult." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a stock option vest. Ben's face went completely pale, a mask of pure horror. Davenport's smile finally vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stare. I pushed my chair back and stood up. "In 5 years," I added, unable to stop myself, "you'll be begging to buy us for 5 times this amount, and my answer will still be no." I walked out of that room feeling 10 feet tall. I felt like a titan, a conqueror who had stood up to an empire. I had defended my creation's honor. It wasn't until Ben caught up to me in the parking garage that the reality of what I'd done began to set in. He wasn't yelling. He was worse. He was quiet, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "What was that, Alex? What in the hell was that? You just spat in the face of one of the most powerful men in the industry. That wasn't business. That was your ego on a rampage." "I was defending our integrity, Ben," I shot back, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. "He was talking down to us. He was offering us security for life," Ben yelled, his composure finally breaking. "I'm not worried about the company, Alex. I'm worried about you. I don't know who you are anymore. The guy I started this with in a dorm room would have at least listened. He wouldn't have burned the whole world down just to feel powerful for 5 minutes." We stood there facing each other under the harsh fluorescent lights of the garage, the space between us wider than it had ever been. He saw a man who had lost his way. I saw a man who lacked the courage to follow me. Neither of us realized it at the time. But he was right. I hadn't just burned a bridge with Omnicorp. I had lit a match to the very foundation of our partnership. It was the first, deep, unmistakable crack in the empire. And I was the one who held the hammer. The aftermath of the Omnicorp meeting wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, creeping rot that began to infect the core of our company. The exhilaration I felt from that act of defiance quickly faded, replaced by a cold, gnawing need to prove that I had made the right choice. My decision to reject their offer had been a gamble made with everyone's future, and now I was pathologically driven to ensure the outcome justified the colossal risk. This wasn't about building a great company anymore. It was about vindicating my own judgment. I had painted myself as a visionary, a maverick who saw a future others couldn't, and I would sooner burn the whole enterprise to the ground than admit I might have been wrong. A dangerous feedback loop began to form around me. A king who only listens to sycophants will eventually believe his own propaganda. I started to systematically distance myself from anyone who dared to question my instincts. The veteran board members who came from Marcus Thorne's firm, the ones who had given us our first chance, were the first to go. Their cautious advice, once valued as the wisdom of experience, now grated on me like nails on a chalkboard. Phrases like market volatility, fiduciary responsibility, and long-term sustainability became triggers for my impatience. I saw them as dinosaurs, incapable of comprehending the speed at which the future was arriving. In a series of calculated and politically ruthless boardroom maneuvers, I replaced them. My new board was younger, hungrier, and, most importantly, completely in awe of me. They weren't there to provide oversight. They were a hand-picked audience, a chorus of yes men who saw my impulsive decisions not as risks, but as bold strokes of genius. They mirrored my own self-perception back at me, amplifying it until it was the only reality I could perceive. My ego was no longer just the CEO, it had become the entire executive team, and I was merely its charismatic public face. It was in this echo chamber of my own making that the seed of our destruction was sown. It was an idea so ambitious, so grandiose, that it made Aura look like a child's toy. If Aura could predict the closed, logical system of the financial markets, why couldn't we build something that could predict everything? I called it Project Chimera. The name came from the mythological beast made of disparate parts, part lion, part goat, part serpent. My chimera would be an amalgamation of every data stream on the planet: social media, consumer purchasing habits, satellite imagery, global logistics, even public health data. It would be a predictive engine for human civilization itself. It would tell a company what product to launch next, a government where to allocate disaster relief resources, a film studio which script would be a blockbuster. It wasn't just a business tool, it was my bid for a legacy. It was my pyramids, my Sistine Chapel. When I unveiled the concept to my new compliant board, their eyes lit up with the same feverish excitement that mine held. They saw the trillion-dollar potential, the world-changing headlines. They didn't see the hubris. They didn't see the sheer astronomical cost or the near-impossible technical challenges. But Ben did. Ben, who I had effectively sidelined from major strategic decisions, saw Chimera for what it was, a black hole that threatened to consume everything we had built. He came to my office late one night, bypassing my assistant, with a thick binder under his arm. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked tired, a deep weariness etched into his features. "Alex, we have to talk about Chimera," he began, his voice calm and steady. He opened the binder on my glass desk. It was filled with meticulously prepared financial models, resource allocation charts, and competitive analyses. "I've run the numbers, every possible projection. There is no scenario in which this project doesn't put the entire company at risk. It will drain 40% of our operating capital in the first 18 months alone, with no clear path to monetization. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the personnel. This isn't an evolution of Aura. It's a completely different beast, and it will eat us alive." I listened, but I wasn't hearing his words. I was hearing the voice of doubt, of fear, of the small-minded thinking I thought I had purged from my inner circle. He was still the cautious roommate from the dorm room, and I was trying to build empires. His logic felt like an attack on my vision. "You're thinking in terms of limitations, Ben," I said, leaning back and steepling my fingers, affecting an air of detached wisdom. "Greatness doesn't come from mitigating risk. It comes from embracing it. This is our moonshot. This is what separates us from every other boring analytics company out there. People don't remember the companies that played it safe. They remember the ones who changed the world. And they remember the ones who flew too close to the sun," he retorted, his voice rising with passion. "This is gambling, Alex, not business. You're betting the entire company, our employees' livelihoods, our investors' trust, on a lottery ticket with your name on it. All to prove you were right about Omnicorp." He had hit the nerve. The raw, exposed truth of it. My defense of Chimera had little to do with its viability and everything to do with my own ego. Admitting he was right about this project would be admitting he might have been right about the acquisition, and that was an admission I was incapable of making. The tension between us became a toxic, unspoken presence in the office. Our partnership, once the engine of the company, was now a fractured, broken thing. We communicated through terse emails and third parties. The easy camaraderie that had fueled us through sleepless nights of coding was gone, replaced by a cold, formal distance. He was the ghost of my conscience, and I resented him for it. The final schism came during the Q3 budget meeting. The primary agenda item was the official funding allocation for Project Chimera. Ben made one last impassioned plea to the board, presenting his data, his models, his voice of reason. He argued for a smaller, phased approach, a pilot program to test the concept's feasibility. It was a sensible, responsible compromise. But I didn't want compromise. I wanted total victory. When it came to the vote, I used my majority shareholder status and the unwavering loyalty of my new board members to push through the full, gargantuan budget I had proposed. The vote was a formality. The decision had already been made in my mind. Ben was the lone nay in a sea of enthusiastic eyes. He didn't say a word for the rest of the meeting. He just sat there, staring at the polished surface of the table. That evening he appeared at the door of my office. There was no fire in his eyes this time, only a profound and heartbreaking sadness. The fight had gone out of him. "I can't do this anymore, Alex," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't watch you drive this thing we built together off a cliff because you refuse to listen to anyone but yourself. I don't recognize you. I don't recognize this company. I hope, for your sake, that you know what you're doing." The next morning, his letter of resignation was on my desk. He was exercising the buyout clause in our partnership agreement. The process was swift and clinical. I bought out his shares, using company funds that I justified as a strategic consolidation of leadership. I brought in a slick, ambitious new COO who agreed with every idea I had before I even finished the sentence. As I watched Ben pack the last of his personal belongings from his office, a small part of me, a voice I had long since silenced, screamed that I was making a catastrophic mistake. But the louder voice, the one that now ran the show, told me that this was a necessary evolution. I had shed dead weight. I had removed the final obstacle. I was now in complete, absolute control of my destiny and the company's future. I felt a surge of liberation, a heady sense of freedom. I had finally cut the last tether to my past, to the cautious boy in the dorm room. I was free to fly as high as my ambition would take me. I was standing on the edge of a precipice, convinced I was about to take flight, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just willingly, arrogantly, and irrevocably sawed off my own wings. With Ben gone, the last dissenting voice in my world had been silenced. The corporate culture at Aura transformed to reflect my own unchecked ego. The atmosphere, once a vibrant hub of collaborative debate and intellectual sparring, became a monarchy. I was the unquestioned ruler, and my decrees were treated as gospel. We stopped hiring people who were smart enough to challenge me and started hiring people who were smart enough to agree with me. The company became a monument to my genius, and every success, no matter how small, was another stone laid in its construction. Every failure, however, was swiftly blamed on external market forces, incompetent subordinates, or plain bad luck. My reality distortion field was now impenetrable. The departure of my co-founder, however, created a void. Ben had been more than just a business partner. He had been my conscience, my reality check. Without him, a subtle but significant recklessness began to seep into my decision-making. I had always been a risk-taker, but my risks had been calculated, backed by data and a healthy dose of paranoia. Now my gambles became more about the thrill of the bet than the soundness of the investment. I started using Aura's capital as my personal venture fund, making impulsive multi-million-dollar investments in flashy, unproven startups. My criteria for these investments were dangerously subjective. I wasn't looking at their balance sheets or their go-to-market strategies. I was investing in founders who reminded me of myself, arrogant, brilliant young men with world-changing ideas and a supreme disdain for convention. I saw myself in them, and funding them felt like funding my own myth. It was a way of validating my own journey, proving that my brand of disruptive genius was the only one that mattered. These deals were often made over expensive dinners or at exclusive industry parties, sealed with a handshake and a shared sense of invincibility. I was no longer an investor. I was a patron of audacity, a kingmaker in my own mind. Meanwhile, Project Chimera was metastasizing. It had evolved from an ambitious research project into a bloated, unwieldy behemoth that was consuming our best engineers and a terrifying portion of our revenue. The technical hurdles we encountered were far greater than I had anticipated. We were trying to build a cathedral with toothpicks. The data processing requirements were astronomical, and the algorithms required a level of nuance and contextual understanding that was perpetually just beyond our grasp. The project was a spectacular failure in slow motion, but I refused to see it. In my mind, we were always just one breakthrough away, one brilliant line of code from cracking the puzzle. I would call all-hands meetings and deliver impassioned speeches, painting a vivid picture of the future Chimera would unlock. I sold them a dream of a world perfected by data, a utopia we were on the verge of creating. The younger employees, swept up in the cult of personality I had cultivated, would leave these meetings energized and inspired. But the veteran engineers, the ones who had built Aura from the ground up, would exchange worried glances. They knew the truth. They saw the fatal flaws in the architecture, the insurmountable data paradoxes. They knew we were chasing a phantom, but they were too intimidated to say so. Dissent was career suicide. The first tangible sign that my gilded world was beginning to tarnish came from an unexpected quarter. A small, scrappy startup out of Austin, founded by two former Google engineers, launched a new analytics platform. It was nowhere near as powerful or sophisticated as Aura. It lacked our predictive depth and our elegant interface, but it was fast, cheap, and incredibly easy to use. It did 80% of what Aura did for 20% of the cost. When my new COO brought them to my attention, I laughed. I called them a toy. I saw them as an insignificant nuisance, a gnat buzzing around the head of a giant. Let them fight for the scraps in the low end of the market, I declared arrogantly. Our clients are the titans of industry. They don't want cheap, they want the best. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, born of pure, unadulterated hubris. I fundamentally misunderstood the nature of disruption. I failed to see that good enough is often the most dangerous competitor to the best. Our sales team started to report a troubling trend. We weren't losing major accounts, not yet, but we were struggling to close new ones. Potential clients, especially mid-sized firms, were balking at our price point, mentioning the good enough alternative from Austin. The gnat was starting to bite. My response wasn't to adapt or compete. It was to double down on my vision of grandeur. Instead of addressing the market shift, I poured even more money into Project Chimera, convinced that its eventual completion would render all competitors obsolete in one fell swoop. It was like seeing a crack in a dam and deciding the best solution was to build a taller tower on top of it. The pressure began to mount, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't experienced in years: doubt. But I had built my identity so completely around the idea of my own infallibility that I had no mechanism to process it. I couldn't admit weakness, not even to myself. So I sought refuge, not in the counsel of wise advisors, but in the intoxicating rush of high-stakes risk. I discovered the world of private, high-stakes poker. These weren't friendly games in a back room. These were games held in the penthouses of tech billionaires and hedge fund managers, where the minimum buy-in was $250,000. Here, in these smoke-filled rooms, I found a new arena to prove my genius. The table felt like a microcosm of the business world, a place of bluffs, calculated aggression, and psychological warfare. And for a while I was good at it. I could read my opponents, exploit their tells, and make bold moves that left them stunned. Winning at the poker table gave me the validation that was slowly beginning to erode in the boardroom. The chips were a tangible measure of my cleverness, a quick, addictive hit of success that soothed the growing anxiety in the back of my mind. Losing, however, was a different story. A significant loss at the table felt like a personal refutation of my intellect. It wasn't just losing money, it was losing an argument, and I couldn't stand it. I would chase my losses, making bigger, more reckless bets, convinced I could outsmart the simple mathematics of probability. I was treating my personal finances with the same arrogant disregard for risk that I was applying to my company. The lines began to blur. The gambler in the penthouse and the CEO in the boardroom became one and the same. My decisions about the company's direction became less about strategy and more about going all in on my own perceived brilliance. I was signing contracts without proper due diligence, acquiring smaller companies based on gut feelings, and spending lavishly on marketing campaigns that were more about stroking my own ego than acquiring customers. One night, after a particularly brutal poker game, where I had lost over $500,000 of my own money, I stumbled back to my empty penthouse as the sun was rising. The city below was quiet, a sleeping giant. I stood at the window, the same spot where I had once felt like a god, and for the first time I felt a tremor of genuine fear. I saw the network of lights not as a system I had conquered, but as a complex, indifferent universe that did not care about my vision or my genius. A single terrifying thought cut through the fog of whiskey and exhaustion. What if Ben was right? The thought was so horrifying, so utterly destabilizing to the entire construct of my identity that I couldn't allow it to take root. I pushed it down, burying it under a fresh layer of defiance. I went to my desk, pulled out my laptop, and drafted an email to my CFO. I instructed him to liquidate a 7-figure portion of the company's short-term investments and transfer the funds to the Chimera project's operating budget. I wrote a memo to the entire engineering team announcing that we were accelerating the timeline, that I expected a working prototype by the end of the next quarter, no matter the cost. It was a desperate, panicked move disguised as bold leadership. I was no longer steering the ship. I was frantically trying to patch the holes with billion-dollar bills, all while telling the crew that we were about to break the world's speed record. The cracks were no longer subtle fissures. They were deep, gaping chasms, and the entire structure of my empire was beginning to groan under the unbearable weight of my own ego. Before I walk you through the final catastrophic collapse, the part where the entire house of cards comes down in a single gut-wrenching gust of wind, I want to ask you something. If you're getting any value from this story, and you haven't subscribed yet, please take a moment to do so. It means a lot. Now, looking back at the wreckage, I've asked myself this 1,000 times, and I want to hear your take in the comments. What was the point of no return? Was it turning down the Omnicorp offer? Was it forcing Ben out? Or was it the obsessive gamble on Project Chimera? I'm genuinely curious to read what you think my single greatest mistake was. The fall wasn't a gentle decline. It wasn't a slow, dignified slide into insolvency. It was a free fall. It was the terrifying, stomach-lurching sensation of the floor disappearing from beneath your feet, a violent plunge into an abyss I didn't even know existed. An empire built over years of sleepless nights and relentless ambition can be dismantled in a matter of weeks. Mine was. The avalanche began with a seemingly innocuous tremor. A major market correction, the kind that happens every few years, rippled through the global economy. It was precisely the type of event Aura had been designed to anticipate. But we missed it. In our all-consuming focus on the fantastical future of Chimera, we had neglected our golden goose. Key updates to Aura's core algorithms had been postponed. Our top data scientists were all assigned to my pet project. Our flagship product, the very engine of our revenue, had been left to rust. When the market zigged, Aura zagged. Our predictive accuracy plummeted, and for the first time, our clients lost substantial amounts of money relying on our platform. The news spread like wildfire through the financial community. Trust in that world is everything. It's a currency far more valuable than the dollar, and we had just defaulted on our entire reserve. The first few clients to cancel their multi-million-dollar contracts were a shock. The next dozen were a crisis. The wave of cancellations that followed was an extinction-level event. Our primary revenue stream dried up to a trickle almost overnight. Simultaneously, the high-risk startups I had so cavalierly invested in began to implode. These companies, built on hype and charisma just like my own, had no resilience. When the easy venture capital money disappeared in the market downturn, they folded one by one, taking my millions with them. The checks I had written with a flourish of arrogance were now worthless pieces of paper. Each failure was a nail in my company's coffin, a testament to my own short-sightedness. Panic is an acid that dissolves rational thought. I entered a state of frantic denial, working 20-hour days, fueled by caffeine and a growing sense of dread. I called emergency meetings with my board, but the sycophants I had so carefully selected were useless in a real crisis. They had no answers, only fearful, searching looks directed at me, their infallible leader. But the leader was gone, replaced by a terrified imposter who was just beginning to grasp the scale of the disaster he had orchestrated. The calls started coming. First from the banks. The friendly account managers who had once fawned over me were replaced by stern, impersonal voices from the risk management department. They spoke in a cold, unforgiving language of loan covenants, collateral shortfalls, and margin calls. I had leveraged the company's assets, and even my own personal stock, to fund the insatiable appetite of Project Chimera and my reckless side investments. As the value of those assets plummeted, the banks demanded their money back. Immediately. To meet the margin calls, I was forced to sell huge blocks of my personal and company stock on the open market. It was a bloodbath. The massive sell-off signaled to the world that we were in dire straits, causing the stock price to collapse even further. Each sale was a desperate act of triage that only accelerated the bleeding. I was amputating limbs to save a patient who was already dying of a massive hemorrhage. The atmosphere in our opulent, futuristic office became toxic. The vibrant energy was gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating blanket of fear. Employees whispered in hushed tones by the coffee machine, their faces etched with anxiety. Layoffs were inevitable. The first round was brutal. I had to stand in front of hundreds of brilliant, dedicated people who had believed in me, who had trusted me with their careers, and tell them they no longer had a job. I delivered the news with a hollow, pre-written corporate script, unable to look them in the eye. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The end came in the form of a certified letter. It was from Marcus Thorne's venture capital firm, our original investors. The board members I had ousted had been replaced, but the firm still held a significant stake and, more importantly, certain legal rights I had overlooked in my arrogance. The letter was a formal notice, invoking a clause in our shareholder agreement that allowed them to call an emergency board meeting to vote on a change of leadership in the event of gross financial mismanagement. It was a coup, perfectly legal and ruthlessly executed. The final board meeting was the most humiliating experience of my life. It was held in the very same conference room where I had once been hailed as a visionary. I sat at the head of the table, but I was no longer in charge. I was a prisoner on trial, and the verdict had been decided long before I walked in. Marcus Thorne was there, his face a mask of grim disappointment. The board members who had once been my loyal cheerleaders now avoided my gaze, their allegiance shifting to the new center of power. I tried to fight. I made a desperate, rambling speech about long-term vision and the temporary nature of our setbacks. I pleaded for more time, promising I could turn things around. But my words were empty, devoid of the magnetic confidence that had once been my superpower. I sounded like what I was, a desperate man begging for a stay of execution. The vote was swift and unanimous. I was removed as CEO and chairman of the board of the company I had founded in my dorm room. I was escorted from the building by security, carrying my life's work in a single cardboard box. The personal fallout was just as swift and brutal. The bankruptcy proceedings were a methodical dismantling of my entire existence. The penthouse, the McLaren, the watches, the art, it was all seized and liquidated by creditors. Men in suits with clipboards walked through my home, putting yellow tags on my possessions, reducing my life to a series of auction lot numbers. I was a pariah. The friends who had flocked to my parties and basked in my reflected glory vanished. My calls went unanswered. My texts were left on read. The silence was deafening. I had built a world around myself that was entirely transactional, and when my value went to zero, so did my relationships. I hit the bottom on a cold Tuesday night. I had been staying on a friend's couch, one of the few real friends from my pre-fame life who hadn't abandoned me. The eviction notice for my apartment had been finalized that day. I was officially homeless. I had less than $1,000 to my name. My phone buzzed. I looked down and saw Ben's name on the screen. It was the first time he had tried to contact me since he'd left. My finger hovered over the screen. An overwhelming wave of shame, so powerful it made me nauseous, washed over me. I couldn't face him. I couldn't bear to hear the "I told you so" that I knew I deserved. I silenced the call and tossed the phone onto the cushion beside me. I curled up on that lumpy sofa, in the suffocating darkness of my friend's living room, and for the first time since I was a child, I cried until there were no tears left. It wasn't just the money I was mourning. It was the man I thought I was. He was gone, and I had no idea who or what was left in his place. There's a strange and brutal clarity that you can only find at rock bottom. When you've lost everything the world tells you is important, status, wealth, influence, possessions, you are left with nothing but the stark, unvarnished truth of yourself. The noise of the world finally fades away. The sycophants, the admirers, the critics, they're all gone. All that remains is a profound, terrifying silence, and the unfamiliar face staring back at you from the mirror. For months, that was my entire universe, the four walls of my friend's spare room and the ghost of the man I used to be. The initial phase was a deep, paralytic shame. I couldn't bring myself to leave the apartment. Every person I might see on the street felt like a potential accuser. Every headline I avoided online felt like it was screaming my name, branding me a failure. The digital Midas had become a punchline, a modern-day Icarus whose melted wings were now a case study in business school textbooks on the perils of hubris. Sleep offered little escape, as my dreams were haunted by a recurring loop of my greatest mistakes. The smug look on my face in the Omnicorp meeting, the sad resignation in Ben's eyes, the sea of blank faces in that final, humiliating board meeting. My friend, Mark, the one who gave me his couch and then his spare room, was a saint. He was a software engineer I'd known since my early Stanford days. He never once judged me or said, "I told you so." He just quietly left food outside my door, paid the rent without mentioning it, and occasionally would just sit in the room with me in silence, offering a presence that was more comforting than any words could have been. He was a lifeline to a version of myself I had long forgotten, the kid who loved the puzzle of the code, not the glamour of the outcome. Slowly, agonizingly, the paralysis began to recede, replaced by a dull, aching need to do something. I started by taking walks late at night, when the streets were empty, just to feel the cold air on my face and remember that the world was still turning. I started reading again, not business books or tech journals, but philosophy and fiction, stories of human struggle, resilience, and redemption. For the first time in years, I was consuming ideas that had nothing to do with market share or competitive advantage. I was rebuilding my mind from the ground up. The hardest step, the one I put off for months, was the most necessary. I had to call Ben. I rehearsed the conversation in my head 1,000 times, preparing for every possible response: anger, indifference, bitter satisfaction. One afternoon I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest like a trapped bird, and dialed his number. He answered on the second ring. There was a long pause, a chasm of unspoken history and pain between us. I finally broke the silence, my voice cracking with an emotion I couldn't hide. "Ben," I started, I don't need anything. I needed to tell you. You were right, about everything. And I'm so incredibly sorry for what I did to you, to our friendship, to the thing we built together." The words hung in the air. I braced myself for the blow. Instead, what came back was a simple, quiet sigh, heavy with the weight of the past 2 years. "I know, Alex," he said, his voice softer than I remembered. "It's good to hear from you." We talked for over an hour. There were no recriminations, no lectures. He just listened. He told me about his new life, a small consulting firm he had started, helping early-stage startups avoid the pitfalls we had fallen into. At the end of the call, he said something that fundamentally shifted my perspective on everything. "You know, Alex," he said gently, "you didn't fail because you weren't smart enough. You failed because you started believing your own bullshit. Welcome back." That single conversation was the fulcrum on which my life began to pivot. The apology didn't magically fix my financial situation, but it began to heal a much deeper wound. It reconnected me to my own humanity. It reminded me that my worth wasn't tied to my net worth. My life today is unrecognizable from what it was. I live in a small rented apartment in Oakland, across the bay from the glittering towers where I once ruled. My car is a 10-year-old Honda that gets me where I need to go. I work as a technical consultant. I take on small projects, helping young, passionate founders navigate the treacherous waters of product development and scaling. I don't make a fortune, but I make a living. And more importantly, I make a difference. I've become the advisor I so desperately needed and so arrogantly dismissed. I teach them that culture is more important than code, that humility is a greater asset than genius, and that a partner who will tell you the truth is worth more than 100 investors who will tell you what you want to hear. The crazy thing is, I've never been happier. The crushing weight of maintaining the genius persona is gone. The constant gnawing anxiety of protecting a massive fortune has vanished. I find joy in simple things now: a well-written piece of code, a long hike in the hills behind my apartment, a quiet dinner with the small circle of real friends who remained. I sleep soundly through the night. I am, for the first time in my adult life, at peace. The ultimate lesson that this brutal, beautiful, and catastrophic journey has taught me is this: money is a tool, not a scorecard. I used it as a measure of my worth, a way to prove to the world and to myself that I was special. I thought that building a $75 million empire would fill the void of insecurity I carried inside me. But it did the opposite. It was like pouring gasoline on a fire. The money amplified my intelligence and ambition, but it also magnified my ego, my insecurity, and my profound fear of being seen as ordinary. It isolated me, trapping me in a prison of my own success. Losing all that money was like a controlled demolition of that prison. In the rubble, I was forced to find something real to build a new life upon. I discovered that true wealth has nothing to do with the number in your bank account. It's in the strength of your relationships. It's in the integrity of your character. It's in the quiet satisfaction of doing meaningful work. It's in the ability to look at yourself in the mirror and not see a success or a failure, but simply a human being, flawed and resilient, who got a second chance to get it right. I lost a fortune, but I found my soul, and I wouldn't trade it back for all the money in the world. The real success story isn't about how I made $75 million by the time I was 28. The real story is about how I started living after I lost it all at 30. So that's it. That's the story of how I built an empire and burned it to the ground. It's the closest thing to an honest confession I can offer. But I hope you understand that the point of sharing all of this isn't to put my past on display like some sort of museum exhibit of failure. The story isn't really about me. It's about the ideas that consumed me, the universal traps that are laid for anyone who chases success without first understanding themselves. My name might be on the story, but the themes are woven into the fabric of our culture, our ambitions, and our modern definition of a life well lived. If you take only one thing away from the hours you've spent with me, let it be this. The most dangerous lie you will ever be told is that there is a finish line. Our society is obsessed with this myth. It's the number in the bank account, the corner office, the headline in the magazine, the sold-out company. We are conditioned to see life as a series of levels to be conquered, and we believe that at the top of that final level lies a permanent state of happiness and fulfillment. We tell ourselves, when I just get there, then I'll be happy, then I'll be secure, then I'll have made it. I reached that mythical finish line. I stood on the podium, showered in the champagne of my own success, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that there is nothing there. It's a phantom destination. The feeling of victory is fleeting, a sugar high that wears off, leaving you with an even greater hunger than before. Why? Because the game is rigged. As soon as you reach one finish line, a new, more distant one appears on the horizon. The first million only makes you crave the 10th. The national recognition only makes you yearn for global renown. It is a hedonic treadmill disguised as a ladder, and it will run you to exhaustion, leaving you with nothing but a hollow core and a desperate need for more. The real journey, the only one that actually matters, is the internal one. The goal isn't to arrive at a destination, it's to become a person who can find peace and purpose regardless of their location. This realization is what forced me to completely redefine the concept of wealth. I had spent my entire life chasing the most superficial and fragile form of it. Now, I see wealth as an ecosystem, a holistic measure of a life's richness. The first and most critical component is a wealth of relationships. The transactional, conditional connections I had at my peak were a liability, not an asset. They were a fair-weather fleet that abandoned me at the first sign of a storm. True relational wealth is having people in your life who are not your mirrors, but your windows. People who show you a perspective you can't see on your own. It's having a Ben who will tell you the hard truth when you don't want to hear it. It's having a Mark who will offer you a couch with no questions asked. These are the human anchors in the storm, the only assets that appreciate in value when everything else in your life is depreciating. The second form of wealth is a wealth of time. At the height of my success, I was the poorest man I knew in this regard. Every minute of my day was scheduled, optimized, and owned by my company, my investors, my own relentless ambition. I had the financial freedom to buy anything, but I lacked the temporal freedom to enjoy anything. I was a slave to my own creation. Today I control my schedule. I have the autonomy to decide what projects I take on, when I work and when I simply exist. The ability to wake up without a crushing sense of obligation, to take a walk in the middle of the afternoon for no reason other than the sun is out. That is a form of luxury that no supercar or penthouse could ever provide. And that leads to the third, and perhaps most durable form of wealth, a wealth of purpose. My purpose used to be a number, a valuation, a net worth. It was an external, fragile thing that could be and was taken from me. My purpose now is internal. It is to be of service. It is to use the painful lessons of my past to help others build a better future. It's the feeling I get when a young founder I'm advising has a breakthrough, when I see them choose a culture of collaboration over a culture of ego. This purpose doesn't depend on the stock market or on public opinion. It is generated from within, and it is something no one can ever take away from me again. Finally, let's talk about the most misunderstood concept of all, failure. We are taught to fear failure, to see it as an endpoint, a final judgment on our capabilities. This is a profound error in thinking. Failure is not a verdict, it is data. It is the most potent and unfiltered feedback mechanism that exists. My $75 million collapse was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of my education. It was a brutally effective, albeit incredibly expensive, seminar on humility, character, and the human condition. Think of it like a controlled forest fire. My ego had created a landscape of dead undergrowth, pride, arrogance, insecurity, that was choking out any possibility of real growth. The fire of my failure burned all of that away. It was terrifying and destructive, but it was also cleansing. It scorched the earth, but in doing so, it created the fertile ground from which something new, something healthier and more resilient, could finally grow. If you are facing failure in your own life, whether it's big or small, I implore you not to see it as a final destination. See it as a clearing. See it as an opportunity to rebuild, not from scratch, but from a foundation of experience. The pain of failure is real, but its lessons are priceless. And so we come to the end of our time together. My story is just one of many, a single data point in the vast spectrum of human experience. If this narrative, this confession, has resonated with you in any way, I'd ask you to do one small thing. Share this video with one person you know who might need to hear this message, not for the sake of views or algorithms, but because these are the conversations we need to be having. We need to talk more about our struggles, not just our highlights. And for my final request to you, I want to turn the tables. I've shared the most significant lesson my life has taught me. Now, I want to learn from you. In the comments below, please share this. What is the single greatest lesson that money or life itself has ever taught you? I'm not looking for quotes from a book. I'm looking for a piece of your story, a truth you learned the hard way. I will personally read through every single one. I believe there is more wisdom in that comment section than in any business book ever written. Thank you, truly, for listening. Thank you for allowing me to share my wreckage and what I found within it. Whatever you are chasing, whatever you are building, I hope you do it with courage, but also with kindness. Take care of your ambitions, but more importantly, take care of each other. I'll see you next time.